Open Market is sponsored by AdLib, the self-serve DSP solution making advertising easy. What do the world's largest demand-side platforms have in common? They're effective, but they require large annual contracts and spend minimums. With AdLib, growing agencies get a single platform that connects to every top global DSP with no contracts, no spend minimums, and G2's #1 ranked support. That means access to the entire universe of TV, digital out-of-home, audio, display, video, and native without a hassle and with no blind spots. It's incredibly easy to use, plus it can automate most of the work your team spends hours a day doing manually. Get the most powerful media buying technology without the barriers to entry. Check out AdLib at getadlib.com today.
Okay, here's how we're going to do this. Fighting out of the red corner from Brooklyn, New York, by way of Long Island, representing Team Outcomes, we have Joe, the Blaster, Zappa. Fighting out of the blue corner, weighing 100 and unknown pounds, from New Jersey, representing Team Quality, we have Erez, the Killer, Levin. I want this to be a clean fight. No rabbit punches, no elbows. Get in the middle, touch gloves. We're going to do this. Get it on.
Nothing below the belt, okay, Joe?
Eric would know all about dirty fights because he's been punching his dojo gym 27-year-old competitors in the balls for years, I've heard. He is the menace of South New Jersey, or wherever he lives, in the rural place where the rich people hide in their mansions. We are the real people. I'm here live from the humble borough of Brooklyn in my glass box, and I'm ready to do battle.
I'm in between, so we're mid-generation here. Yeah, it's going to be a good one. I thought about bringing my boxing gloves for real, but I figured we'll keep this mostly peaceful.
We'll keep it peaceful. All right, so for the listeners, we have Erez Levin, who is notorious for his posts across LinkedIn and X, longtime thought leader in Adtech. We're here to talk about quality and outcomes and solving all the world's problems, right, Joe?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, that's really the difference between us, Eric, is that Erez tries to solve all of the world's problems. I just look at the problems clearly and say, how can we make as much money as possible by exploiting them? That's really the difference. Is like, I'm a hack. Like, I'm just a consultant. People call me in. They're like, what's going on? How do we win given what's going on? And Erez is like, I want to create a healthier information ecosystem with advertising. I'm like, I want to do that too. When I'm working with Scope 3 and when I'm working with the people who are ruining the information ecosystem, I'm just like, how do we drive outcomes, guys?
It's a fair point. The only thing is, I think you joined about 10 to 20 years too late. And so most of that's been squeezed out. And now we're at the inflection point where I think we're going to get to the healthier, less arbitrage and less waste opportunity.
What we're talking about is I did a post a few months ago announcing that we were in the outcomes era. And actually what spurred this post was an Omnicom earnings call in which CEO John Wren was talking about their acquisition of the commerce media company Flywheel. And it really struck me, given that, as Erez says, like this has sort of been a paradigm for like 10 years, that John was saying, you know, it's all measurable now. I remember he specifically said, I think that or something very close to that. And it did strike me as odd that he would add that sort of recent temporality to it. But I think it's, again, due to the Flywheel acquisition and the ability of holdcos, which have historically been associated with brand advertising, big brands, you know, frequency and reach, those kinds of KPIs to drive sales and to grade their work on that basis. I think, however, that the holdcos, as I just mentioned, being like sort of figures of brand advertising, are not actually the paradigmatic drivers of the outcomes era. I think that's Google and Meta, who have obviously built the biggest media businesses of this era. You know, search and social combined, roughly $500 billion category. For some, you know, sense of scale, like CTV is a $30 billion market, linear is like 60, right? And so my argument is that we are essentially in the era and in the industry that Google and Meta have built. Now, how have they built that giant business? By driving outcomes or by claiming to do that. Google and Meta are the titans of the industry because they're the ones who can go to advertisers, especially performance advertisers, e-commerce brands, millions of SMBs, and just say, give us your money and we will drive sales, which I think is the ultimate outcome that advertising exists to facilitate. However, I would say the outcomes era thesis is not just limited to the bellwethers of Google and Meta. If you look at the two fastest growing channels in digital advertising, it's commerce media and CTV. Commerce media is essentially an outcomes channel, right? It's now becoming more full funnel, but the reason it's ballooned is because the commerce media owners, e.g. retailers or a company like Uber or PayPal, they are close to consumer transactions. And so they are well positioned to drive transactions, which is the outcome that really matters, which is sales. And CTV, same thing. CTV is about bringing the digital capabilities of targeting and measurement to branding's favorite channel, historically speaking, which is TV, to do what? To better, target consumers and drive sales. And now we see with performance TV and the rise of companies like TV Scientific, Vibe, Mountain, TV moving even more in the performance direction. And so my argument is that if you look at the industry across all these different spaces, the walled gardens, the holdcos, commerce media, CTV, everyone is talking about outcomes and everyone is measured on their ability to live up to that standard. One final thing I will leave you with is that LiveRamp did their earnings call, I think yesterday or the day before. We'll release this next week, so it'll have been the previous week. And the outcomes era was central to CEO Scott Howe's remarks. And they were talking about how they are able to put together the full picture of consumer behavior and therefore enable their customers to drive outcomes everywhere. So the outcomes era is ascendant, but if you'd like to make your rebuttal, you can try, Erez.
All right, let me try. So I think if you're reading corporate websites, press releases, and listening to earnings reports, it totally makes sense that you're going to conclude that we're entering the outcomes era. But for a lot of people that have been in this industry for a while, and I think the conversation, it started for a while ago, but what you continued and we saw online, there's sort of two camps. And what I think is the common thread for a lot of people that believe we're entering or should enter the quality era, it's people that have been in this space for so long and have seen sort of the corruption of it because of this obsession on outcomes. And I think it's hard for a lot of us to understand how do we actually move towards an honest outcomes space where we don't lose sight, where everyone can just say the word outcomes and hope that no one else asks too many questions about what does that actually mean? What is an outcome? And does that actually translate into the business results that someone really cares about? And is that someone actually just taking credit for an outcome that was going to happen anyway, or that someone else contributed to? And so I think that's where maybe a little bit of the difference is and why you see two different camps and some people that have been operators sort of in the underbelly and seeing campaigns work and not work and really violating, in my view, what I saw given my time at Google and elsewhere is the violations of fundamental sort of marketing principles and fundamentals. And a lot of that being driven by this obsession on quote unquote outcomes.
Like point to examples of what you mean by like the underbelly or some of the things that are going on that, the listeners might not be as familiar with and if they're not, hands on keyboard.
Yeah. So I can give a little bit of a background because I think this also explains, my biases, which I, readily admit to. So this is why I came to this conclusion. But I've been in this space for a while and was at Google for a very long time. And the last decade that I was at Google, I sat on two different roles for the most part. I was on the Adtech buy side, and then I was on the, working with all the DSPs that plugged it into our inventory. And then I was on the DV360 side where I worked with all of the SSPs. And so the lens that I had was really micro and macro view of supply that was getting plugged into the ecosystem. And to borrow the phrase from Chris Kane that I love, I was seeing what DSPs were eating and not eating. And I'm a naturally curious person. So I was always seeing, I'm like, why is it all this app inventory that no one is touching? Or why is this all this new inventory that's coming in that DSPs are eating, buying a lot of and paying a lot for? And so I saw all these anomalies. And over time, I was sort of raising these and saying, hey, this seems like a risk or an opportunity to Google, to our customers, whoever it was. And as I continued to sort of pull on those threads, I understood, I think, one common theme for all of them, which was the supply side was evolving and innovating rapidly over the last decade plus. New formats, new environments. The buy side didn't really adapt that much. The buy side said, oh, what do we need to do to make sure we're ingesting? Oh, it's an audio format. But we didn't really change the measurement. We didn't really change how we were going to understand the value of certain media. And I think that's where those inconsistencies started to come in. And I tried to correct them where I could within sort of the context of Google. I can give one really clear example because it's the most important one for me. It's probably the first one that I noticed, and it only got bigger. It was the one that I couldn't solve my whole time, and that's on video. And so, when video started on the web, it was YouTube and Vimeo and Dailymotion, and it was sort of in stream, right? There were video sites that you'd go to, and you would see video ads in stream before, during, and after the video ads that you went to watch. What we saw that evolution and really great innovation was the format called Outstream. And that came in various different formats, app interstitials. But the one that came in really, really dominant was the small little, video ads that you see in the bottom corner of a page and teeds and things like that. And the problem was, as those grew, the buy side continued looking at viewability and completion rates as their primary metric to value media. And so what we saw over time is that more and more spend moved towards these outstream formats and valued them the same, paid the same amount as they were paying for in-stream. And that was sort of the degradation that we saw of the video market. And so that's just one key example of why I think this focus on outcomes, because completed views were an outcome. And what buyers were getting, and ultimately maybe that was the outcome, or maybe a view through conversion that later happened that they could tie to that impression was the outcome. And since that's all they focused about, they didn't really look to see, hey, was this really worth the $10 CPM that we were paying?
Yeah, Rez, that's a great example. I don't think anyone would disagree with the notion that we have historically, as an industry, sometimes optimized for bad outcomes or not the right outcomes, or that the measurement of the outcomes hasn't been distorted. I think everyone understands that that's sort of part of the picture. I think what matters in terms of this argument is what is the terrain on which the war is being won? In other words, if you think there are bad outcomes, I don't think that the answer is to say, okay, well, now we're not going to think about, quote unquote outcomes. We're going to think about, optimizing for quality media or something like that. Because quality media is still a proxy itself that could be turned into an outcome, for one. And that also is, again, ultimately proximate to what everyone really cares about, which is driving more sales, right? Advertising as an engine of revenue. Now, that's a full funnel equation, right? There's the brand lift stuff, there's top of funnel and whatever. But ultimately, we're all trying to approximate and get to sales. So if you think about noted sharp pen darlings, Tim and Chris Vanderhook, they will talk about the same argument you're making regarding Google and Meta not driving incremental sales, and ROAS, which is like a commonly optimized for outcome, kind of being bullshit because it's not really incremental. But the argument they make isn't, well, Google and Meta are bullshit and they're peddling BS outcomes, so you should just buy high quality media. Their answer is CTV is actually the number one channel for driving incremental sales, and we will show that. So they're still competing on the level of outcomes. Quality is just a factor that sort of ultimately drives that desired outcome. And you need to show that your outcome is better than theirs and that theirs is BS or not incremental. Now, I do think that's why you see another discussion burgeoning in the industry about incrementality. You could essentially view incrementality as the synthesis of our two theses, in the sense that incrementality is about what you might call quality outcomes, right? It's like, okay, we achieved an outcome. Now, was the outcome actually real and incremental to our business? Or is it just, an an outcome for the sake of saying we delivered one, but really we were going to get that sale anyway. So who cares?
I would correct it a little bit because I would call it incrementality is actual outcomes, actual effectiveness. Quality, to me, the way that I've always defined quality is sort of, it's a relative value, right? There's high quality, medium quality, and low quality. And so if it's not incremental, it's not an outcome at all. It's not this sort of, it's much more of a binary. Obviously, you can be more incremental, right? There's a percentage of how much incremental value you added. I don't disagree with everything you said before, though. And I think we're drawing not an arbitrary line. I think it actually is really important, and it's going to have a big impact. There's a couple of things of why I believe this can happen. And to be clear, it's not that I believe just that this should happen. I do believe it's going to happen. And there's a number of other reasons for this. One is with cookies going away, we're going to lose the ability to do all of the attribution that our system has been built on. And the argument that I made, recently was we failed at outcomes when we had a cookie on everything. And so now we're going to lose this universal identifier that's enabled for targeting and tracking across devices. We're going to lose that. So it's going to be much harder for us to do that in the future. And two, I think there's something that we've never grappled with in this industry is this concept of quality media and the scarcity of it. There's not that much. Everyone just followed a cookie. And if you were on an MFA site and that cookie appeared there and then they converted later, that got credit. But the reality is, and that could be a small little ad playing in the bottom corner, that could be one of 20 ads on the page. That's not quality media. And it likely didn't contribute nearly as much to that ultimate outcome. And so once we don't have that cookie, once we see most of this sort of fake in-stream go away, buyers are going to have to deal with, there's actually a finite amount of really high attention, sound on, CTV or other in-stream video. There's a really finite amount of media that has a first-party audience on it that I can target, that I know who that person is maybe exactly, or I know something else about them that allows me to target them more specifically. Forget even being able to then measure if they did something later. And so as we sort of deal with that scarcity, the good stuff is going to become much more valuable. And I think the way that it's going to be valued is, of course, its likelihood of driving an outcome. But ultimately, and I'll finish one last point, and I think this is also a really important one. Right now, we've been able to optimize towards outcomes because we have this universal sort of identifier and tracker. When we lose that, we're going to calibrate to outcomes, but most impressions, you're going to look at the value of them sort of probabilistically, right? In sort of a large group, a large pool of inventory. And so the way that you value every single impression and make a decision, do I bid? How much do I bid? Do I buy that? What's the currency for that? To me, it's going to be quality. It's not individual impressions likelihood to an outcome. It's the quality of that impression and what have I seen in the past for that level of quality, sound on versus sound off, above the fold, or somebody on a site about cars, reading about cars. I think that's going to be a higher likelihood of that person then buying a car or, getting gas, whatever it is that I'm trying to get them to do.
So it seems to me that this is about cookies largely for you. So in this future, this is like a good future for walled gardens. This is a good future for commerce media. This is probably a good future for CTV, which does not operate, with cookies. It sounds like a really bad future for the open web. Is that how you're thinking about this?
I think it's a bad future for the long tail of the open web. I think high quality media will still be valuable. And so the way that I define quality, the way that I think that the web is going to be decommoditized from what it is today, where as long as you found a cookie, it's basically worth the same. Doesn't matter if it's on the New York Times or some MFA site. I think most media will be valued according to the attention level, right? How prominent an ad placement is. So really big with the sound on, a big banner versus the 300 by 250. And then whether there's some, what the audience composition is. So maybe the exact user, if you know who they are, if they're signed in, or whether it's the FT. If someone's visiting the FT, I don't need to know exactly who they are, but I know they're probably a high value customer and might be interested in certain products. And so those two, I have a 2x2. And so you have CTV with first party audiences is going to be some of the most valuable media that there is. then you're going to have a Vox.com, which is generic audience, but maybe it has a really big banner on the top. And so that's still valuable. It's still sort of high attention. Then you have FT, which is maybe a 300 by 250, but it's a valuable audience. That's also in this sort of medium value range. And then you have like long tail MFA sites that you know nothing about the person, and it's a 300 by 250, just an adjacent ad. It's not worth nothing, but it's worth a lot less than those other three sort of quadrants.
Yeah, Rez, I agree with a lot of what you said. I think that the shift away from third-party cookies, yeah, it's interesting because it'll have a lot of ramifications, and I'm not sure they will necessarily benefit quality media. So, one is that, as Eric said, that pushes people toward commerce media because they're already close to the transaction. It pushes people toward the walled gardens, so more for Google, Meta, Amazon, etc. It pushes people towards CTV, and I think you'll also see those companies through partnerships with companies like TV Scientific, but also maybe by trying to enable commerce on their own platforms through connections between CTV and like mobile apps. You'll see them also try to drive and align themselves with transactions. So I'm not clear that I see like the idea that, okay, we won't have the cookie anymore. So then like the way you're going to have to buy inventory is like another metric, and maybe that metric is quality. I think like maybe a little, but I think that primarily like it'll drive people towards those other environments that are just closer to transactions. And then you'll also have, to your point, though you think this will be marginal, or at least secondary, it seems, you'll have like probabilistic models. You'll have like what Google itself is doing, right? Google last week released Meridian. It's open source MMM. Why are they doing that? Because the deprecation of cookies is killing, last click attribution. So they need other ways to show that search and YouTube are effective, and MMM is a way to do that. And if you look at the Meridian announcement, they're going to talk about, the propensity of a channel to drive sales, conversions, all these kinds of things. And so I don't know that it's going to get us out of the outcomes era. However, I have clients who are essentially they're champions of the publisher ecosystem, or at least that's their business, right? That's how they have to position themselves. That's what they want to be doing. A lot of them also, they're not primarily programmatic partners, right? They're trying to enable direct sales. So they have a stake in this sort of the woes that the programmatic ecosystem has foisted upon the premium publishing industry. I think it is a very interesting question related to what we've been talking about for publishers, i.e., given the outcomes era, which has essentially allowed the walled gardens to eat their lunch for the last 10 to 15 years, what do they do? Do they try to show that they can also drive sales, even though they're much further from the sale, and therefore it's just a much more complicated position for them than it is for, say, retailers or walled gardens? Or do they run in the opposite direction, exactly as you're saying, and say, we don't want to be judged on that. It's not an accurate way to judge us. It's like, it's sort of impossible to know, or it's a necessarily distorted metric. It's a losing game to compare our ability to drive incremental sales to that of the walled gardens. So judge us on something else, like, hey, do we actually get you in front of your target customer? Is the ad actually visible? Is it going to influence them and gain their attention? And that's, why companies like, say, an Adelaide exist, and they say they have a media quality metric, is because they arm publishers with the ability to do that. And you can make the argument that it's better for advertisers because then they actually know they're reaching consumers, whereas they might not be if they're buying this other media that's supposedly incremental, but often isn't. My thing is not that won't be a feasible argument. I think it's a good argument, and it's one those companies should make, and it's one maybe the media owners should make too. I just think it's secondary to the sort of dominant paradigm of the industry.
Today, I completely agree with you. I just think that's where things are going to change. I just think the system that we've built up, proving outcomes, the walled gardens and the non-walled gardens, it's just not going to work anymore. The walled gardens will be able to do it within their ecosystem, but they're going to, just like commerce media, and I'm not an expert there, but everyone is fearful of all of them taking credit for the same sale. Right. And so this is the risk that we're going to get. And same thing when we sort of balkanize, when cookies go away fully, and we're going to see sort of this split. Everyone's going to try to take credit for the same conversions, the same outcomes, and they're not going to be able to all get that same credit. And so I think that's where the narrative breaks a little bit. I want to pivot a second because I think this is a useful example because I've been thinking a lot about performance CTV. I know an area that you think a lot about, care a lot about, are really bullish on, and I have some mixed thoughts about it. And so I'll give you the example. I believe in the power of CTV, like very much so. The sight, sound, in motion, big screen, wide reach, especially sort of from the linear days, but you can do the same thing in theory with CTV. Of course, there's a ton of low quality stuff, which I'm certainly concerned with because I think it masquerades just like we saw outstream on the web. There's plenty of that stuff here, and I think it can hide. And buyers generally, they're not. Some of them are not. Don't look so closely. Now, taking a step back for a second, you mentioned MMMs. I think a lot of folks, smart folks on the measurement side, they believe that the future as we lose cookies is going to sort of be this concept of triangulation, MMM, MTA, and geo experiments. And so big clients, big buyers are going to do all three and then try to find what's the right blend. They're not going to get all of the truth from any one of those, but they're going to get sort of different insights, different levels of granularity, and try to bring those together and decide, how they plan and how they buy. Now, with performance CTV, I believe it will work. I believe it is incremental. Big buyers, big enterprise buyers, they can do what they've always done. They run MMM, they run geo experiments with CTV. They know what works. They can understand even a little bit more granularly, not just the channel sort of overall, but individual ones, maybe understanding audiences and day parts and things like that. Even sort of medium-sized businesses can probably do something pretty interesting, especially if you've got locations all over the country. You're a restaurant that has franchises. You can actually do different experiments on the geo side there. If you're e-commerce with CTV, you can also probably turn things on and off and understand how much it's driving actually incremental value, especially when you're running lots of other media. The thing that I'm a little bit bearish on, or a lot bearish on, is this idea of small, mom and pop shops, right? Like the local ice cream shop. I don't think, even though I believe it's incremental, if I turned on my TV and I saw an ad for the local ice cream shop there, I probably would say, oh, that's an interesting one. I don't know that one, or I forgot that one. I'm going to go to it. And I will in the next 30 days, 60 days, or maybe in the next year. So it's actually going to drive incremental visitation and sales, whatever that is. But how are they going to prove that? I think it's going to be incredibly hard for small businesses that are not sophisticated. They can't do experimentation. And they're also sending me coupons, right? I get a thing in the mail every once in a while. There's a lot of other things. The TV will make a difference for me personally, but how are they going to know that? And so I'm not saying they won't invest there, but I don't think they're going to invest any serious amount more than they do with their mailers or, any other sort of direct digital or non-digital channels.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, first, I share your perspective that to the extent that anyone should be bullish about performance TV, I would bet on first the performance marketers, like the e-com marketers who contribute a lot to Google and Meta's revenue. I would bet on them coming over to performance TV. That would be the first thing. And I believe, for example, TV Scientific, that's the bulk of their current customer base. And then I would bet on, enterprises in mid-market potentially looking at all of the TV spend they're doing through the holdcos and being like, hey, we're spending like $1 billion on your, hundreds of millions of dollars on like frequency and reach. Maybe we could get a better outcome, right? Like, could we actually prove we're driving incremental sales instead of just accepting that we're reaching this many people? I do think it's harder for SMBs. That said, I think that is exactly the role for startups to play. Like, to the extent that equation is going to be solved, I think it will be by startups who can make that small business owner feel. And it also might not be like literally a one shop thing, right? But it might be like a chain of, 10 yogurt shops, to use the example from The Social Network. Like, it's making the person who's running marketing for that company feel like, okay, the same way I go to Google and Facebook, and even if like we might argue it's fallacious, like they say, I put in this much and this is what I got back. You need to make TV work by the same dynamics. Whatever they've gotten used to with Google search, you need to make them feel that the same is true of TV. And that's where like you have someone like Jason, the CEO co-founder of TVSci, who like was one of the inventors of the search auction. It's like, that's the whole idea, right? Is can you make them feel that?
Yeah, that's how I feel. So I'm like, I believe the channel works and is effective as incremental. Can you show a better ROI to a small business than what Meta and is going to show them? And so that's my one sort of, I need to see that. And I think there's certain buyers that will work for, and a big class that it's unclear to me how that will work. I just wanted to use that as sort of one example of why I sort of have a healthy dose of skepticism, and why I believe quality measures, if there's a broader recognition of the value of quality, attention, or sort of these other specific tactics that work, reach people at certain time of day, auto intenders or whatever else, they spend time here. If there's proof for that for a category, then other category buyers might be willing to buy there even when they can't prove the outcome. And that's a little bit of what I think is worth us talking about. When we talk about quality, we talk about outcomes. How are we going to define them? The way that I look at quality is that it's a media metric.
Yeah, you look at things from a sell side perspective. It's very clear.
I thought I had a big advantage sort of because I sat on the sell side and the buy side. And so I do see things through both of those lenses. But quality is a media metric, right? It's the thing that you can evaluate and you can bid towards. You can't bid towards an outcome. You used to be able to, maybe when we had cookies, but we're losing the ability to predict on a deterministic, on an impression by impression basis, the likelihood of an outcome. That's just not going to happen. Now it's going to be for these 1,000 impressions in this geo at this time of day or whatever else. You can start to whittle it down a little bit, but it's rarely going to be at an individual level unless you have a first party signal for a user. That's going to be rare. That's going to be the really small minority of all of the impressions available to be able to bid and say, I think this person is likely to convert if I show them this ad. And so now we're looking at a media metric is the main determinant of the likelihood of, or the value of that impression. And so once upon a time, and I think this is, I commented it earlier, and I don't know the answer. I really am still trying to figure it out. Before the digital age, what was the top currency for media buying? It was reach and frequency. Is reach a quality measure?
I don't think so. I think reach is an outcome that's much more upstream of sales than marketers would generally like. And I would say like sales is the ultimate outcome, or incremental sales. And they're always sort of looking for the closest outcome they can get to that while remaining, somewhat tethered to reality. And sometimes
So
might argue.
If reach is an outcome, then is an impression an outcome?
Neither. I don't think either of them are outcomes. I think they're both numbers. They're both metrics.
That's how I think about their quantity, right? They're
quantitative.
They're just counts. They're counts. They're unqualified.
That might inform, some sort of like econometric model if a buyer is like, coming from that perspective. But yeah, they're just numbers.
So that's how I think about it. But once upon a time, reach was actually more of an outcome because it was closely tied. But reach used to all be the same. Reach is all reach. And now we have this fragmented landscape. So once upon a time, even all impressions were created equal. Not anymore. So now it's quality reach, is quality adjusted reach, is the quality measure or quality or an outcome. It can be either one. But reach on its own or impressions on its own are nothing. They're pretty much meaningless, but we have too many people still relying on them. And I think that's where sort of things broke, where the landscape fragmented so much, yet we continued to rely on, hey, as long as an impression, as long as we served it to these people and something happened later, we're going to give that credit to the impression.
You're like very passionate and driven about this stuff. Like it's very, very clear. What are you going to do about this? You have a founder quality to you about these topics. I just like pick up on these signals. What are you going to do? Like you're somebody that wants to move this industry forward.
Yeah.
This was an audition for funding, Eric. Come on, catch up.
Got him.
Yeah, I'm passionate about this. Like I really am quite idealistic. I've wanted to sort of fix the space. I've seen what's broken. I generally, for many years, even while I was at Google and since then, looking to support anyone who is moving towards this sort of quality era. Because I think that moves towards, and I care about this for a lot of reasons, but I think this is like good for the world. I think this is good for democracy and the news industry. And like, I think that we've been chasing outcomes to our doom, essentially. And I think most people would agree in a lot of ways. And so generally, I've been looking to support companies, and this is with my advice, and this is with my time, and this is with my money, and different ways. So I don't know. I don't know what's next. I'm at the beginning of a new journey. There's lots of folks that want to know how I can help them. I do have some big ideas about where I think things are going to go. And I've shared them before. I put everything basically, out in public. Something I'm happy to share here, and I'm happy to share elsewhere too. But the companies that have, and I'll make this a little bit more specific, because my vision of the quality era is defined in three ways. There's three pillars for quality. There's media quality, there's creative quality, and there's data/audience quality. And my view is the winners in this industry, who I believe will win and who I want to see win, are the companies that either have higher quality media, can create higher quality creative, or have higher quality data and audiences, or can help differentiate between high, medium, and low quality in any one of those pillars.
Yeah, I mean, Eric, I was thinking even about, as a VC, like your portfolio. I think your position is somewhat similar to mine, Eric, in that like you work with a bunch of different companies who have many different vantage points on the space, and some of which may have conflicting vantage points, right? So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you and I are somewhat similar in like we don't see our job as like we have intuition and like analyses of where the space is and where it's heading, but we don't really see it from an idealistic perspective in the sense that like our job is to realize one future or another. And I think that is in many ways the difference between like the individual tech entrepreneur like a Brian O'Kelly or like the future Erez in 6 months from now, and when he launches his quality startup, and Eric and me, is that like, and I think it, I said this in my LinkedIn post today about the outcomes era versus the quality era, because Erez and I have been back channeling about this, and like I do think part of it is just like descriptive versus prescriptive. It's like, are you describing what is, or are you trying to describe like where you would like to see the industry head? We might quibble about some differences nevertheless, but I do think that sort of analytical disposition is part of what we're arguing about.
And I think, just to be clear, absolutely, I know where I want it to be. One of my things is just, I've seen it be so broken, so much waste, right? Advertisers are wasting tons of their money. And I just don't think it can continue. Like, it's only increasing. And so I always said, like, it is inevitable until somebody comes in and says, like, we shouldn't be doing this. We're wasting a lot of money. And they actually turn towards better ways to measure and buy, which is ultimately equality. That's why I've always sort of been so like, this is going to happen. I started talking about this many years ago, and I told everyone this is inevitable, but I have no idea when it's going to happen. Now I do feel it's much more imminent than it ever has been.
And I do think, Joe, you characterize how I might view the ecosystem from an investing lens well. But like, look, we're an investor in TV Scientific. We're an investor in Adelaide, which is, trying to, advance this idea of attention as a metric, as a proxy for both quality and, the ability for it to drive outcomes. We're an investor in Scope 3, trying to decarbonize this shit. So, and I think all three are going to be like, tremendously successful businesses at the end. So, doing good and trying to advance the cause is not inconsistent with like building a good business.
No, for sure not. I think that definitely not inconsistent. I think that there are kind of two different elements to the quality thing, though, because sometimes when people talk about quality, they're talking about quality media, which is, I think, mainly what Erez is talking about. Sometimes they're talking about, are the outcomes actually of quality? And so they mean, like, is it a legitimate outcome? And that's when, like, you're talking about incrementality or not. And I do think, like, 2024, I wrote the week after I wrote the outcomes era piece, I wrote a piece called like 2024 is the year of quality in the outcomes era. And the idea was basically to explore quality along both of these vectors. One is the increasing attention to the quality of media, which can be a factor in in performance, in the ability to drive outcomes. And that is, you see the rise of companies like Adelaide, you see the Trade Desk Premium Internet push and then buying Sincera, the brand safety stuff, the MFA craze, like all of that is like about concerns for quality. And so I don't at all dispute that there are going to be big quality businesses built, and that also it's an important issue in the industry. But I think that ultimately it is a factor in the pursuit of outcomes. And I would add, I don't think the pursuit of outcomes is necessarily nefarious, right? Like if we're talking about the pursuit of incremental sales, I mean, that's what advertising exists to do. We're all down with that. Let's build big businesses with advertising, yada, yada. If quality media is going to be a factor, or maybe even the factor that's going to drive the most incremental sales, then people will rally around it and it will win in the market. And that's part of like the success of like an Adelaide and what they're trying to accomplish. Obviously, my contention is that it will be a factor, but maybe not necessarily the factor that determines how media is evaluated going forward.
And I think that's why we're both like, there's no way to be right here. We're both right. We're both arguing basically the same thing. It's just which is the primary focus. And one of the lenses I have and why I'm so adamant about it is because I've seen everyone means well, but one I believe is more likely to lead us down the wrong path, right? Is just to get abused in a way, the one that has been until today. And that's where I think about what's a healthy ecosystem. A healthy market is one where there's the maximum amount of efficiency. And what leads us there, where the price that buyers pay for media and how much they spend on different media matches its value to how much it actually drives their business. And I think one of these is more likely to, as sort of the driving force to get us there than the other. And if we had a way, and I'm going to think about it, that we can make a friendly wager to know who wins, I think it would be really, really fun.
This is like when, this is the Adtech version of when Nate Silver was fighting with Keith Raboy on Twitter during the election season. And Keith was like, Trump's going to win Florida by more than 7 points. And Nate was like publicly arguing with him about this and being like, I will take I forget how big the bet was. It's like, I'll take $100,000. Yeah, it was something like that. It was like 6 or 7 figures. I think 6. And he was like, I'll take $100,000 bet that doesn't happen. And Nate was wrong. And Keith didn't take him up on the bet. So, 5 years from now, we'll have you back on and we can debate who's the Keith and who's the Nate of the situation. But Erez, I loved this. You have argued with me openly and publicly and always like very respectfully. So I appreciate that. I think we are modeling healthy public debate for the ecosystem. We can just send that clip to like 2 or 3 people who might need it, who might need to learn. And it's great. I'm glad you came on.
Thank you. This is awesome. This is going to obviously be continued. And so looking forward to it. And we're going to have our separate camps. So we'll see how the industry decides.
At this point, as the referee, I'm going to have to call it a draw. To the listeners, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Hopefully you like this stuff. Let us know. And you can find Erez on the socials. What's your handle?
E1111 on X and then Erez Levin on LinkedIn.
Thank you so much, man. Joe, always a pleasure. Everybody, we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys.